Thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening. As a Muslim Palestinian mother, these last several weeks have been so deeply challenging on so many levels. I've been running NewGround for a really long time, it feels like, and in faith communities for well over 2 decades, and I don't ever remember feeling like this. The profound stuckness, the profound grief and pain that I see in people's eyes, and it really is challenging on so many levels, but especially the personal one. I knew as I started to learn about the details of October 7th, that I needed to urgently reach out to friends, and that I would never be able to reach all of them, not in the way that they deserved to be loved, but that it was important, and that I needed to bear witness and to hear. And I heard stories about not even knowing what to say when you go to a friend's child's funeral, not knowing how to bear witness or to really show up, but knowing that you have to, that it's part of being in relationship. And then as things continued to unfold in everyday sense, feeling profound pain of friends who have family members in Gaza and who are continuing to hurt in the deepest possible ways, asking excruciating questions. And for me, not even knowing what words to say or what to do. And knowing that it's important to do it nonetheless. But what strikes me is the profound loneliness, these feelings of existential threat. And I look at my Jewish friends and I see it. And I look at my Muslim or Palestinian, Christian or other friends and I see it. And they can't see each other. And I feel this helplessness. And I know that I need to make sure that we see each other's pain. And I also know that I see this rising tide of awful behavior that must be spoken up to, that must have another outlet or different outlets, and that every single person rising in this moment really doesn't just matter, it's essential. And I know there's a lot that we're all holding, and it's not possible to bear witness to all of it, but we can sure try. And so tonight, I'm honored to be here in conversation with people who I've known for some time, who I know who are dedicated towards building something even when we know that it's quite challenging. And especially when we see the chaos around us and we know that community is essential. I think to the last book that Martin Luther King Jr. published before he was assassinated, actually came out shortly after, and it's actually titled Community or Chaos. And he asked some really profound questions. Who are we? What are we? What are we really going to do in this moment? And so as we navigate this chaos together, I'm going to lean into both of my friends on the right and the left and ask, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? What are you bearing witness to, especially with the rise and some of the things that we're seeing both in chaos and the way people are expressing hatred or expressing really strong emotion and the way it's especially exacerbating into terrible violent action.
Thank you so much to everyone for coming this evening. I think there are many answers to that question. I think there are many horrific things that we are seeing. And so I want to tease out and highlight a few of them, but first just acknowledge some that we won't have a chance to dive into tonight, but must be amplified and spoken about. On October 7th, there was real triggering of trauma for people, whether they be Jewish or not Jewish, or Israeli or not Israeli. I actually, this morning, spoke to somebody who is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. And she told me that after October 7th, she was in 1994. And I think that we need to acknowledge, and it's not going to have a time to really delve into it tonight, but the fact that people were truly triggered and traumatized from October 7th. The other piece of it is that the global Jewish community is 0.2%. So closer to 0 than 1% of the world's population. Tiny. And that means that nearly every single Jewish person is at least 2 degrees separated from someone who was killed on October 7th, kidnapped on October 7th, raped on October 7th, or has now been forced to put on a uniform because of October 7th. And so the connectivity and the closeness to it is at the surface and is very close. And it feels like a communal reckoning and pain. The most difficult thing here in Los Angeles, and I know we talked a lot about trying to focus in on our community in our city, is the rampant anti-Semitism we are seeing, the rampant Jew hatred we are seeing here in LA. Just last weekend, a man was beaten with a belt because he was visibly Jewish. This increase, this horrific increase in hatred against Jews because of a international relations political thing happening very far away, translating into real actions, real violence, real words, real horrific graffiti, protests, screams, cries, anger, violence against people who happen to be Jewish is really, I think, what we're looking at as this tremendous challenge we are facing in real time here in LA on the ground. So on top of that trauma many people are feeling and carrying that has been triggered, and on top of knowing someone or knowing someone who knows someone or knowing someone who knows someone who knows someone who has been killed or is in immediate danger, on top of all of that, we are facing a reckoning of humanity because it has become a place where it is okay to hate Jews. And that is something that we need to be confronting currently.
Yes, standing up to in really the most strong possible ways, and showing up for them when they are hurt. Like, all these pieces are really essential.
I didn't know if you wanted me to do the hope part too.
No, not just yet.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, if there is, right? It's like, what do we hold? Before we go to you, Jordanna, I want to make a correction. I was a Civil and Human Rights Commissioner. I have now completed my term. And Jordanna, you've been at the helm of human relations at the city for a very long time, and you've been seeing how communities coming together is both important and this bearing witness to what's been going on right now. Like, what are you seeing?
Thank you, Aziza, and thank you, Jordanna. And I certainly want to thank Beth and the Museum of the Holocaust for hosting this. And quite honestly, I could not have thought of a better place to have this conversation. And just to look at the images and the constant reminders that words, as you said, do matter. And for me, this comes from a personal place, but I do want to also talk a little bit about the city and what we're seeing in terms of trends. I mean, for me personally, I feel a personal, not just responsibility, but a burden. My ancestry comes from the Armenian genocide on my father's side. And knowing that, and knowing that seeds of hate can lead to genocide, this is core to who I am and to the work that I do. Ultimately, my family survived. I was born in Aleppo, Syria. I grew up there. And so I also hold dear the core values of what it means in community and what it means to be in a democracy and to contribute to society. And so my work with the city comes from these very personal places. Unfortunately, and as Jordanna very well painted this very difficult picture that we are seeing, but we were seeing this before October 7th, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that. Prior to October 7th, we were still seeing anti-Semitism at its highest. In fact, the LA County Human Relations Commission released their report on hate crimes recently for 2022. And for 2022, we saw the highest record of hate crimes in 21 years. That is an 18% increase from the prior year, from 2021. The events also came at a time when we as a country are extremely polarized. We have lost our ability to have civilized public discourse on all sorts of issues. And so coming into the events of October 7th, this was sort of the state of being of where we are as a country, but as a city, I always had a lot of hope because I know and I have worked very closely with people from across religions, people of faith, non-faith. There was always a space in Los Angeles where we all felt a part of the city, where we all belonged, regardless of where the data and where we're seeing the hate increase. There were always these acts of, I don't want to just say kindness, but there was always a space where we stood together. I've seen it, I saw it in 2008, I saw it in 2006. I saw people standing in front of mosques when there were hate crimes at mosques. And similarly, I saw people stand in front of synagogues when there were acts of hate against synagogues. These are things that I have to say are a little unique to LA because I don't necessarily see that in the rest of the country, and I certainly don't see that in Europe. And I was just recently in Berlin and visited the memorials, and it was incredibly moving walking through the Jewish communities there. So to paint this picture that yes, we were coming into this with a very high increase in already hate crimes and anti-Semitism, but not to forget that we also had here in LA a number of efforts that are working across faith communities, but standing up with each other. I know we're not talking about hope, but I want to put that as part of our landscape. But I want to zoom in a little bit more, because now I'm talking prior to October 7th. October 7th, when we started to look at the data between October 6th and November, like towards end of November 27th, there was a 139% increase in hate crimes against Jewish communities as compared to the same period of time to the previous year. Similarly, we saw an uptick against Muslim, Arab communities by 650%, same period of time compared to the previous one. So we're seeing the sort of mirror between a vast increase in anti-Semitism as well as a vast increase in Islamophobia and hate crimes targeting Arab and Muslim communities, broadly speaking. On October 7th, it was very difficult. I mean, as I watched, just like everybody, watched things unfold, there was this gut instinct and this gut reaction, and my immediate instinct was to reach out to my Jewish friends. And I did. Text, calls, that was my instinct. Because on so many levels, because of my sort of personal perspective on this and coming into this from my own personal experiences, I could only imagine what they were feeling. And the pain and the trauma that I heard in everybody's voices that I talked to was so real, and it affected me personally. And as things continued to unfold, I heard that same level of just pain in the voices of my Arab friends, my Muslim, my Christian friends who do have direct ties to the region. I mean, we at the city of LA have the second highest Arab American population in the country. And we have one of the highest Jewish populations in the country. And so the reality of the impact for our city and the people of our city is so profound. And we're coming into the space with a very emotional and deep pain and deep hurt. And I think we really need to pause, because we can't go on and pretend as though we can just continue as normal, because it's not. I've spoken with people who have lost 90 family members in Gaza. Others have lost, 40, 20, and I can go on. And these are not numbers. These are people. These are human lives. And when I talk to people who have connections with hostages, and when I speak with friends who have direct connections to family in Israel, it's that profound pain. And this is our landscape right now. Our landscape is this very heavy time where it's the reality of the pain that everyone is experiencing and the trauma that everyone is experiencing, and that trauma is ongoing. And as we start to look at numbers, when I hear numbers, whether that's 16,000, 18,000, I don't want to put numbers, because these are human lives. And at the end of the day, we are all connected in our humanity. The pain and suffering of any human being, we bleed the same, we feel the same pain. And so that, again, I go back to this notion of this burden and responsibility, just as an individual, coming into this space and finding ways in which we can navigate the pain and the chaos, but do it in a way where we can not only see each other's humanity, but to simply say, I see you, I see your pain. And let's just start there.
Starting there. There's a heaviness to what you're both describing that is so deep and profound and hard to get past. And as you hold that heaviness and the feelings of not being able to even orient, because there's just so much happening all at once, and these really big emotions, they're so deep and they hurt so deeply, so they hold so much of us that it's hard to even move through them and past them. And I'm wondering what grounds you in these particular moments. Thinking specifically, there's a Native American poem, and it's more than a poem. It's when kids would go and they would kind of have their they would have to go into the wilderness and try to make it on their own. It's like a coming of age. They would be in the wilderness, and the way the poem goes is, child, you might be lost in the trees and the bushes, and your head is spinning. But child, you might not know where you are. Pay attention to the trees and the bushes and get to know them, and they will show you. They know where you are, and you will find your way. And there's something about traditional things in our traditions that I think can help us in these moments, but also that you might be doing that really help ground. And I'm really curious, what are some of those things?
So, different ways that I find grounding, I would say, or light. Tonight's the last night of Hanukkah, so thinking about when are we finding light amongst darkness, is in community relationships, personal and professional, seeing people be supportive and caring and kind in the face of such darkness. I often say, I work here at Holocaust Museum LA, and I often, when I talk about those who saved Jews during the Holocaust, I always say the Holocaust shows us human capacity to do the most horrific things to one another, and also shows us the human capacity to do the most courageous things for one another in the face of that. And yes, one group of those people is very, very large, and the other group is very, very small. But it's those small stories and those small actions that have a true ripple effect that I find very grounding. And that is also what I'm seeing now. Amongst all of this hate and this anger and this violence, there are small acts of kindness. There are people who are showing up for one another in tremendous ways. And that is what I look to when I think of, what is grounding me, what is giving me light right now. I think, for me on a very personal level, my grandmother who's still living. I have one surviving grandparent. And after escaping Nazis, she lived in Jerusalem. And in 1948, she survived a terrorist attack at 16 years old. And here she is at the end of her life in her 90s, listening to the news, very aware of what's going on. And the pain that I hold for her in having to deal with this at the end of her life, how her life started with violence and is now ending with violence and hate. So her life is being bookended with identity-based violence and hate against her as a Jewish person. But when I talk to her, she has this resiliency to just keep going, to wake up every single day, she's blind, to want to have her hair done, brush her hair, she brushes her hair, pet her cats, pet her dog, turn on the news no matter how dark, speak to all of her loved ones, and continue to carry on. And I find that also very grounding, that all around us, people, no matter what, are continuing to continue. And I look to that, and I look to the people who are creating kindness, and I find my solace there, and I find my light there.
The will to carry on and the acts of kindness. You remind me of Rachel Soroti has a book called We Share the Same Sky. And she talks about following her grandmother's footsteps in the early 40s. And she was fleeing for her life, and she was struck by the acts of kindness of strangers. And that is something that still helps her just see what's also there.
Never know how big a small act of kindness can be, right? Like, you can put it out there. I was always raised, not a single person is above you and not a single person is below you. And we must treat everyone as our equal. And you never, ever know when you do an act of kindness what the ripple effect will be. And I think actually that's the best part.
Exactly. Jordanna?
I very much echo what you said, Jordanna. I think for me, I'm really grounded by my faith. I'm grounded by the notion of love of all of humanity. Raised a Christian, within our Christian tradition, it's not love your neighbor, it's love your enemy. Still haven't figured that out. But the more I reflected on what that means and what that is, the more I find myself putting human faces on my enemy. So I'm definitely, my sort of core heart is grounded in that faith. But I'm definitely touched by what you said, Jordanna. I think the story of your grandmother is so profound, because to hold on to anger, that is a self-destruct. When the war in Syria started in 2011, it was very difficult for me to watch the whole thing unfold. And after a while, I just couldn't look at images anymore. It was a war to erase identity, culture, to erase existence, quite frankly. And it wasn't until, I think it was around 2015, if you recall the image of that little boy that washed ashore in Greece. His name is Alan Kurd. That's when the world put a human face on the war in Syria. Every parent identified with that, and it moved the world to action. And I remember that night, and when I saw that image, it just was so gut-wrenching. And at that time, my boys were just a few years older than that little boy. And as I sat next to my youngest on the bed because he was afraid, and as I assured him how safe and how, well taken care of he is in his home and warm bed, And that night, we all prayed for being so abundantly blessed. But the reality, as I walked away from that room after comforting them, I was in tears and I couldn't hold the tears back because that could have been their fate and mine. And that's just the hard reality. I think the more we find it in our hearts, it's the simplest act of kindness. It doesn't, and when I reflect on, my faith and my traditions of what it means to love one another, it's just, again, it's that simplicity of, I see you. And that in and of itself is profound. A few months ago, I moderated a panel, and we had screened a story. It's called Deborah's Hope. I don't know if any of you had seen it, but it was put together by the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and the whole movie and the whole story was about how her mother and her brother had survived throughout the war, and they lived. And in that story, there was this space where they were saved by a Polish woman who hid them in her house for several months. It was very emotional for me to even moderate that panel, understanding the gravity of what that meant. It's that simple act of kindness. And for that woman at the time, as the story was unfolding, she hid them in her home, not thinking of what the ramification could have been for her, knowing how difficult that is. And so, when I hear those stories, I am grounded by those stories. I am grounded by these experiences. I am grounded that in the middle of the Syrian war, it was a rabbi, and many of my Jewish friends called me to check on me and make sure my family was okay. But it was a rabbi that called me and said, "How can we help you? Our congregation wants to help with refugees. What can we do?" That touched my heart and my soul. These were perfect strangers. I'd never met her congregation. And in a different time and space, we could have been pinned against each other as enemies. But yet here we are in this space, seeing each other's pain and reaching out to say, how can I help you? And so I think, these are the things that really they ground me, but that's a place where we can start to look at one another and just say, how can I help you? Because everyone is hurting right now, whether that's your neighbor, the person you work with. Just know that hearts are heavy.
Such important words. How can I truly be there for you? And asking over and over, because sometimes we don't have the answers. You both already leaned into this in some ways. And especially Jordanna, at the beginning, you talked about activated trauma, right? And being in a whole other period. And rightfully so, but that with trauma, when it gets activated, our responses will can come out in severe ways. Like in one case, I had a friend talk about how a partner didn't see what she needed to see, and so she just picked a big fight with him, and it literally played out. And we behave in other ways. Sometimes we're just frustrated, we're angry. And I see things also manifesting with others, right? Especially across disagreement. Forget a partner that you love. Somebody who's maybe you love, but you have a serious disagreement with. Our ability to have hard conversations, this is what democracy is made of. It's the ability to have and be able to work through hard conversations. So what do we do? How can we do better? I'm struck by, when you mentioned the Syrian boy, you're right, I see that image in my head. And I think of the Palestinian boy in Chicago who was stabbed to death towards the beginning of all this, and his mom, and then a young man who was literally, a car revved its engine and hit him up in the Northern California, I guess Berkeley, was the school. But his response was to say, don't use this as an excuse to hate. We need to take care of each other. And I think it takes a lot to say that, especially when you're the one who's hurting. And so how can we do better, especially when a lot of what's activated is a trauma response?
I know we're talking specifically about Los Angeles and our community, but we're so interconnected with social media. And I think social media can be an incredibly beautiful tool of uniting and learning and community building. It can also be incredibly destructive. So I would say a few really key points. One is people have a lot of big opinions on Israel and Gaza. Big opinions, little knowledge. What we all need to be doing, even if you think you're one of those people who doesn't fit into what I just said, we need to be educating and we need to be teaching ourselves. We need to be reaching out to people. We cannot avoid difficult conversations, right? It is okay to be uncomfortable in a conversation. We cannot avoid or skirt these hard conversations, and I would even compel us to be vulnerable with ourselves and with the people we are having these conversations with, because it is about that humanity. It is about remembering the individual people around us, either on our screens or in the room with us. So really, I would say two things is educate, learn. We really need to be so careful about parroting information that we're reading. I know that we feel that sort of that urge, that response to right away, yes, responding with this, going into maybe our flight or fight mode, but really just sort of sitting for a moment and thinking, am I being constructive with this choice, or am I being destructive with this? Is my criticism constructive or destructive? Is the social media post I'm going to make constructive or destructive? Is this text message I'm going to send? Is this conversation I'm going to have with my neighbor? So I would say that all of those are really clear. We need to be educating. We need to be learning. We need to be speaking with one another, especially the people we don't agree with. We are living in an incredibly polarized world. And I think every step you take towards the center, towards reaching the other person, is one step closer we get to building a stronger community.
Well said.
So yes to all of it, but I'm going to come at this from a bit of a different angle and just wear my city hat for a moment. I think at the city level, a lot of what we've been able to do over the years is to build relationships and build trust. The ability to convene spaces for these difficult conversations to happen is just as important as it is to have the people who have the courage to come and have these conversations. And sometimes these are very small rooms. You're not going to see them on the TV screens, and you're not going to see it on social media. But these are the spaces where the relationships and the hard conversations can happen in a way that could lend itself to a different way forward. Because what we have right now is just simply not an option. So part of the work that we've been doing at the city, and part of the work that I've been very directly involved with for a number of years, is convening these kinds of conversations and dialogues. And I'll tell you, sometimes these dialogues, they do break up. I mean, they sometimes, people just come to the table, they have a conversation, the discussion. Sometimes those are planting seeds for bigger things. Even the concept for NewGround started because of dialogues we had convened at the city, many moons ago, not to date myself. But it was in those very small round tables, away from the lights and the cameras, that the conversations and the seeds that were planted that ultimately led to grassroots actions of Jewish and Muslim leaders that said we could do this better and we could do it differently. And so I think what I find hopeful and promising is that here in LA, we're not starting from zero. We're starting with a foundational space where we have had these difficult conversations. But I do want to admit we're at a moment where all of those relationships are being tested. And I have to also be realistic about that. And I think a lot of the work that we have been doing since October 7th has really been direct connections and direct conversations. Even though those are happening in separate spaces for the moment, but our ability to come back together is something that we all have to overcome, and that's all of us. And I know it's not easy. It's not easy to sit in a room and hear something that not only you disagree with, but something that could hurt and be a source of pain. But this is fundamental to not only a striving democratic society, but it's fundamental to any striving society. In the moment we cease to see each other and to be able to have a conversation with each other, we're no longer a democracy. And I fear that we're starting to see that erosion of democracy. I mean, we see it on university campuses, and let's just be honest. When we look at how university students are engaging on this issue, we're very quick to sort of point fingers at students, but let's pause for a moment, because there is a responsibility for all of us. There is a responsibility for administrators, for teachers, for professors, for people who are civic leaders in civic spaces. How have we taught or given the tools to young people to have a constructive public discourse on any given issue? I think it's an important question that we have to ask ourselves. And this is sort of where I see that responsibility in the civic space, to create the convenings, to create the safe spaces, but to also give the tools so that those conversations that are happening can lead to something constructive. We can no longer afford to stand in a place and say, you're either with us or against us. We just, that narrative is a self-destruct narrative. And the only narrative we can have right now is, how do we move as a collective, as a people of a city where everybody belongs? How do we move forward as a collective? And so this is sort of where my hope, and I know we're in a moment of tremendous pain, and it's okay to pause in those moments. I think it's human nature to pause in those moments. But we shouldn't lose track of the need and the responsibility for a democratic society to find its way forward in spite of the pain and the breakdown in relationships.
Right, keeping our eyes on the bigger piece. And what's at stake? What's at stake for all of us? And being able to ground what it is that we truly believe in. There's this activist, she's a climate activist, her name is escaping me right now, but she really just hit something for me. She was talking to other activists, and she said, there is profound pain and grief and anger and rage, and they are real and they come from real places, and our kids are growing up in that real anger and pain and loss, and we have a choice right now. We can raise them with those things exclusively, and we can also make a choice to raise them with the love that they deserve. And I think that's a really hard place to be, and it's a real place to be as well. And so as you kind of think about what does that look like, where do possibilities exist for love and ideals of of who we believe we are and who we can rise to truly be through this. What comes to mind? And then we're going to open up to questions from all of you.
So this Israeli poet Amichai has a poem that is about the place of being right. I'm paraphrasing it because I don't know it by heart. But the place of being right, no flowers will grow. It's barren and hard soil. But with love and doubts, that is where it will grow. And I think there's a whole wordplay in the Hebrew words, but just the core of the message being that when you have love, but you also have doubts, questions, that is where true growth is. And that is what I think is critical right now, to come at everything with love and to come at everything with doubts. I see every single day in my job the power of cross-cultural conversations. We have nearly 27,000 students who did tours of the museum in 2023, 99% of them not Jewish. The learning opportunity and the narrative exchange between people is so critical for the next generation. And I hope that they continue and learn to come to conversations, not from a place of being right, but from a place of love and doubts.
Yeah, if we can't have a conversation, then we have no starting point. And sometimes these conversations aren't, if we only stay in the spaces where we agree and we feel comfortable, we will continue to be in our own isolation. And being in our own isolation will inhibit our ability to be part of a collective. And I fully recognize this, this coming to a space to learn, but I also fully recognize the courage in doing so, because it is not easy. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage not to turn our face away. Not to turn our face away. The humanitarian catastrophe that's unfolding is not something that we can turn our face away from, whether that's happening in Israel, whether that's happening in Gaza, and I can go on, Sudan, I can go on. And so if we start with just ourselves to have enough courage to ask the questions and not to turn our faces away, because we have a responsibility. And as I sit in this space and I recall the stories of the Holocaust and the stories of the war, and at a time when everyone turned their face away, we have a moral obligation. So I will leave it there.
Yeah, like who are we when we turn our face away? Who are we when we let people suffer? A rabbi friend came back recently from a trip other rabbis took, and they bore witness to October 7th and the different things that happened. And one of the questions that really struck me that she came back with was, how do you take a child back to the source of their nightmares, to live, to be? And I don't know. I don't know, but I know we have to keep asking the question. And I know another friend who literally was looking me in the eye, and tears were welling and just flowing from her cheeks, on her cheeks. And she said, it snows in Gaza. People have lost their homes. What will they do? I don't know. I do know that I can't be the person that looks away. I can't do it for my soul. I can't do it for myself. And I know that love can take us through this, as hard as it is, and that it requires strength and enormous energy, and that it is hard. Ooh, so forgive me. We took us in many different arcs, and we want this to continue with a conversation with all of you. So I ask that you ask, and maybe perhaps there's a question that you're sitting with. You have some really remarkable human beings up here who have been doing this for some time, who are dedicated and who are challenged. And I think a lot of us can sit with those huge, taxing paradoxes. Jonathan.
I know you well. I know you well enough to challenge you with this, which is that, and we've people in dialogue and in conversation and who are willing to be there, people who are coming to the museum, being educated, are already halfway there. And probably none of them have committed any anti-Semitic or Islamophobic attacks. So how does one reach, if possible, either directly or indirectly, those who are not interested in knowledge and those for whom ideology is all that they care about? And is there a way to reach that, to get those people in? And I suppose the corollary to that is, how do you deal with that with each of your own constituencies, responding to what's out there as far as that's concerned, if that makes sense?
That's a tough one, Jonathan. But I want to acknowledge you and all the work that I know we've done over the years. And a lot of times it was during fragile times.
I'm sorry for putting you on the spot publicly, because
you're all good. That's why we're up here. So that's I think is the tough one, because when we start to look at the work, and especially in the space of how do we address extremism and how do we address ideology. And a lot of times it's hard to change a collective ideology. It isn't. I know there are certain organizations, Life After Hate is an organization that comes to mind that works with individuals who are leaving neo-Nazi white supremacy movements. And I'll tell you, these individuals, a lot of social trauma. So they work with social workers, and they start to unpack that. So there's the individual level, right? I think en masse, the only way we can shift ways of thinking is if we start in these kinds of spaces. We don't have to think big or grandiose. It starts with these kinds of conversations. It starts with reaching into those who are willing to have a conversation. And that gives you a starting point. And a lot of times in the work that we do, and the way I sort of kind of look at it, they're always the two extremes. And they're not my barometer. My barometer is who's in the middle, and how can we start in the middle and continue to bring people slowly into a space. We don't have to agree. We shouldn't agree on everything. It's just not realistic. But can we have a conversation where we can have a constructive outcome? Yes. So I know I didn't give you the straight answer, but that's just the unfortunate reality of it.
No, so let me give an example, and I apologize, and I know because this is a city, but it's also, is there a way to reach people that are blocking traffic on the 110, and they believe they are the ones who are opening their eyes? They believe they're the ones that are saying to us, no, you have to look and not look away. And I'm only using that because it's the most recent example. And if your answer's the same, the answer's the same, I understand. I was wondering, because for me, that's the tough leap.
It is.
I'd love to chime in here. So there's also, building where Jordanna left off, we have an enormous amount of influence with the people we know. And it's essential that we reach out to people and we say things like, how are you, and how are your loved ones? What are you sitting with? And there's something that releases when we truly hear what people have to say, not correcting them, whatever they say, listening to them, and fully taking it in. Thich Nhat Hanh calls this compassionate listening. It's a very specific kind of listening, and if you want to dive more into it, there's this book called The Art of Communication. And it's literally fully listening, and then towards the end, then if you want, there's something that you need to say, correct course on something. But you don't interrupt, because you will interrupt the flow of whatever it is that they need to be said and need to be seen and need to release. And so keeping your eye on the goal of helping them release, be seen, because there is something they need to be seen, whatever it is, that all of us need to be seen. I know you've done that for me, and I know I've done that for you. And there's something that is holy about that kind of work, because you see the difference in people afterwards. And it's hard. And I see grandparents and grandkids not able to speak or being in a place of yelling, and or other family members, parents and children. And those are also the people that you have a lot more influence with, but you just have to sit there and listen. And it's exhausting, and it's exasperating, and it's important.
Thank you for this presentation, but I think we emphasized the adult responses, and Jordanna alluded to the youngsters. I speak here frequently, and I think we need to start with the youngsters. I think if you wait till you're grown up, and we're our age, I'm older, but if we wait till then, it's too late. I think we need to educate the youngsters before they learn how to hate. Everybody has to learn that, and I always tell them, I want to speak to young people like 4th, 6th, 7th graders, because I want to educate them about the truth and facts before they learn the other side, which is often the wrong side. And I think that's the museum is doing its greatest job by bringing the kids. And I must tell you that kids who come totally unprepared, they have no questions, because they're just beginning to process what is being told to them. And those who have some background, whether it's school or whatever, they already have more questions because they have a foundation. And then I must, in addition, say that I was on a Zoom with the LAUSD in May. All the leaders of the school system were part of it. And as we all know, talk is cheap, but action is what's required. I offered my services through the person who organized it, and I said, I'm there, I will go and do. The teachers don't have to do the job. I've created a lesson plan and all of that, but I'll go and do it. Have you heard from them? No. So this is one of the biggest problems, that we can say we need to do this, but if we don't implement it, we get nowhere.
Yeah, implementation is essential. There's something else that you said that I want to lift up, which is
sorry,
there's something else that you said in addition to implementation that I want to make sure we lift up, and that is to step in and to offer something, like just like what you were doing, and that we keep on doing it over and over, and we just keep on showing up, and even sometimes there's like silence, and you just keep on at it. I am. It's part of like what Jordanna, I guess for me, it was like the feeling, like, yes, it's resilience. Resilience matters right now.
And I would just like to also piece out part of that, which is speaking to youngsters. Now, I've been working in the Holocaust studies field for over 15 years, and so of course everyone texts me and calls me like, when should I start speaking to my kids about the Holocaust? When should I start doing this? How young is too young? And I've been having serious conversations with my loved ones recently where 7 years old is not too young. Your 7-year-old knows more about the world than you want to admit. And if it's not about politics, if it's not about wars happening right now, if it's not about history, there are ways to talk about difficult things with younger kids. And I think education is so crucial. And if we kick the ball or punt the ball and punt it, you end up with people who are already adults who have formed opinions without real education. And so I think that piece of it, of speaking to the youngsters, is so important because kids are truly, truly resilient and have an ability to understand. The other piece I will add is, I believe Instagram launched in 2010 or 2009, around there. That means that since 2009, we have had the opportunity to teach kids social media literacy. And what we are seeing right now is millions of people of all ages who interact with social media without social media literacy. And a little bit to your question sort of about like ideology, I do believe that if you have the two sides, whether you call them right or left or liberal or conservative, red or blue, it's not a line, it's a horseshoe. And the minority of the people are down very close to one another, and it's the bend in the horseshoe where we all aim to be and aim to have people be. And I think that's a really important part. I think that most extremists are fringe, they're just the loudest. So what do we do to combat that and find the majority, even if we're not as loud?
We have a question right here.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. Earlier in the year, I was at the Tree of Life shooting documentary. Was that in partnership with New Roots? Yeah.
Yeah, I was on the panel of the
That's what I
speakers,
thought,
yes.
with Mayor Bass. And I remember I met you, Jordanna, I mean, not that you would remember, but afterwards, and I learned about your work and thought, wow, that's so wonderful the city has this anti-hate commission. In any case, I think back to that panel, to those days, and it seems like, you know, utopia, because the whole point of that panel and that documentary was how the Asian community, the Muslim community, so many communities rallied together in Pittsburgh. And so my question, which may be a little naive, is why do you think some of these grassroots organizations had this tendency to pick a side? You know, it's like I think about the war in Ukraine and nobody was saying, we stand with Ukraine. You know, I mean, that's a little simplistic, but nonetheless, I think, you know, as a Jew, so much of what happened is we reacted. You know, me personally, when I saw Black Lives Matter, the Chicago emblem of, you know, we stand with Palestine with a terrorist in a parachute, I was so horrified. And of course, anyway, I guess my question is, what is the underlying reasoning as a grassroots organization? Is it about appealing to your constituents? Why were those sides taken? Because to me, that's what really fomented so much of the hate, and I'm just confused about the need to take those stands specifically.
Thank you for your question, and that was, yes, I do recall. I met a lot of people, and I know we talked a little bit about the LA for All campaign, and I'd actually been to Pittsburgh a few times now at the Eradicate Hate Global Conference and met with some of the survivors who've lost family members. And it was, you know, again, it was sort of gut-wrenching to hear their stories and to illuminate what it looks like to be able to acknowledge the pain and the suffering and to acknowledge the humanity. And I think Pittsburgh coming together after the Tree of Life was an example of that. And I think it was something we talked about a little bit earlier on the panel, and that is that narrative, you're either with us or against us, right? And this is the very narrative that has been and continues to be a self-destruct narrative. And I think the challenge before all of us here and beyond this room is how do we find the courage to move away from these narratives? Because what we're dealing with and the complexity of it the nuances of it. I mean, this is not just one side versus the other. There's so much complexity to it. There's so much history to it. The nuances that are often completely glanced over. And part of our challenge is how do we shift away from this sort of, stance. And it's not so much about a position. It's about everything that's in the middle. It's about the human impact. It's about the human suffering, the crisis that we are seeing that completely gets glanced over. Because the minute you stand with one side over the other, the minute we're taking these kinds of sides, that's when we stop seeing that humanity and we're just taking a position. And so that's really the challenge right now, is how do we move away from these positions in a way that's going to lend itself to the acknowledgement and lend itself to our abilities to move forward. I don't know that we have any kind of influence over international policies. I don't know that any of us has influence over what happens between governments at global levels. But we do have control over what we do here in our city, in our neighborhoods, in our communities.
Right, because zero-sum actually hurts us just as much as it hurts anybody else. And it's a hard thing to resist and to rise into. As we close out for the evening, and you can loop in anything that you want to really respond to, I'm going to ask you each to, what's a thought that you would really love to leave us with? Where do you see possibility, and where do you see possibility in navigating chaos?
I see possibility staring at me in all of you who've chosen to come this evening and learn and hear perspectives that might be new, might be challenging, might be something you disagree with, might be something you agree with. I see that, and that is really what I think is our possibility, is if each of us leave here this evening and speak to our friends, our family, our Twitter followers, and just remind everyone to take a beat and really consider the words that they're saying, because words do matter. I mean, we're sitting in a Holocaust museum. Hate rhetoric can and will lead to mass atrocity. And really consider, is what we're saying destructive or constructive?
So I echo that, Jordanna, but I'd also say I see possibility in vulnerability. But unless we acknowledge these vulnerabilities and lead from that point, it's going to be hard for us to, make any kind of meaningful forward movement. And I definitely see possibility when we do have these kinds of convenings, and people have the courage to want to come into these convenings. And sometimes it's just creating the space. And so if there's any takeaway from tonight is, in our own ways, let's create a space, because we all have the ability to do that.
We do. We have the ability to do it, and we can own it. I see possibility in that the Holocaust Museum gave the descendant of Palestinians the microphone to lead a conversation about navigating through hard conversations and seeing each other. That takes courage, it takes risk, it takes love, and it's the way forward. That's where I see possibility.
It's a leap of faith, and we all jump together.
Exactly. So they would like to invite you to continue with refreshments and conversation, and really being with one another. Thank you for joining us.